Can you guys see, do you guys see oh, hold up one second. This is the stop sharing my screen. Sorry for the technical difficulties here. Okay, I think this is gonna work. Okay. How do you guys see the screen on your end? I think I'm gonna go to presenter view and then
It looks
okay.
good. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Is it full screen? Is it just a big frog?
No, it's not any.
Okay. It's what do you guys see on your end?
It's like off to the side, and then there's like the next slide that it's
Oh,
what
okay.
the next slide will
Here,
be.
I'll swap displays. Is that
Yeah. Okay, okay, there we
that's
go.
perfect? Perfect. Okay, so I really appreciate you guys having me on for giving this talk. And I did a talk last year that was a little bit similar. So I don't know if anyone's seen anyone that came by last year saw this talk. I've kind of switched things up a little bit. So the title of my talk today is going to be The Art of Being a Frog. And basically what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the diversity of frogs or some of the diversity of frogs we have in our world and what it kind of means to be a frog. You know, there's a lot of frogs that exists in our environments, and a lot of them come in all different sizes, shapes, and a lot of them have different ecologies and functions. So today will hopefully be a good kind of introduction, for what is a frog and how many, different frogs actually exist out there. And so just to kind of start off with my background, ever since I was a little kid, I've always kind of been fond and interested in frogs. So when I was about like 7 or 8 years old, I ended up moving to a small neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, there was actually this pond, I guess, a few hundred feet away from my house. And what I would do is I would go down to this pond and catch frogs, turtles, and this kind of inspired me to, I guess, kind of be interested in wildlife. And I don't really, people always ask me, like, what is it about a frog that makes it super interesting? Because, a lot of people kind of find frogs kind of slimy and gross, but to me, I think they're just, super unique organisms. They are one of the few organisms that can actually make calling sounds, and I just think, in my opinion, they just look really, really cool. And fast forward to today, I still do catch frogs. It turns out frogs aren't just cool, but they're actually really, really useful, like model organisms for studying environmental change. And so, frogs are ectotherms, which means they rely on kind of the external environment to maintain stability in their body temperatures. So that can make them like very vulnerable to, I guess, climate change and other shifts in the environment that otherwise maybe wouldn't affect other organisms as much. And then, frogs are also, bioindicators in a lot of ecosystems. And they're, very sensitive to, again, those changes in the environment. So they do serve as really powerful models, in my opinion, to, studying, changes that we can observe in nature. And so on the left is a photo of a green tree frog, which is a species I used to work on when I was in grad school. And then on the right is a photo of what's called a crawfish frog, which is a very kind of secretive frog that lives in the United States. So I'll hopefully get to talk to you about a little bit more about maybe these two specific frogs later on. But anyways, so those are just two frogs I'm kind of close. My heart is very close to. And so here I'm going to try to hopefully these videos will work. I'm going to try to play a couple videos of kind of how I collect frogs in the field. So this is kind of what I call a visual encounter and hand capture. So you'll kind of approach a frog. It might be calling, so it might be really easily, it might be very easily detectable. So here's a video of kind of what a green tree frog sounds like in nature. So obviously, you pull up to a pond, you hear a frog calling, and it's pretty easy to, catch. But sometimes they can be really, really hard to find. So green tree frogs get their name because they're green and they hang out in green vegetation. So they can be, I guess, very, very well camouflaged. And so in this right video, this frog is not only camouflaged to the background of the plants that it's on, but it's also, it's very shy, I guess you could say. So a lot of frogs, if they kind of hear someone approaching a pond, or they see like some headlamp or flashlight, they'll just stop calling. So what you can actually do when you're in the field, if you're trying to collect frogs, you can actually try to imitate their call and mimic their call. So in this video, you can hear me, I guess to the best of my ability, trying to imitate this frog's call, and it ends up calling back. So you can kind of elicit a response back. So you kind of trick the frog into calling back. So hopefully this one plays too. You can kind of hear me trying to do my best version of the call. Wink, wink, wink. Wink, 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 wink. Okay, so yeah, and you can see that that frog got tricked by me. But yeah, so that you end up, kind of finding them over time. So sometimes you'll just be calling forever, and then eventually you'll kind of elicit a response. Um, Wink. Okay, so then there's other kind of methods I use in my research, and this is a pretty common method for, in general, reptiles and amphibians. So it's called drift fencing with pitfall traps. And so basically, essentially, how this works is you kind of set up a fence maybe around a pond or around an area of high activity. And what happens is once those frogs, start to leave to go towards the ponds, they'll actually hit this fence. So it's kind of like a barrier, right? And so when they hit the fence, you can kind of see that this is a little trap or a pitfall trap. So you can actually dig buckets and like put them along the fence. So when the frog hits the fence, it'll start traveling one way or the other. So it might start going left, and then eventually it'll just fall into the bucket. So you can like periodically check these buckets, and find frogs that are, like, trying to enter the pond because eventually the frog's going to go around until it can try to find a way in. And then once we, capture these frogs in the buckets, then we can like put them in the other side of the fence, and release them after taking measurements and collecting other types of data. But you can get tons of data from from these type of methods. So like if you wanted to go to a pond and try to figure out like population sizes for a certain species or try to get a measure of species diversity, you can get so much rich data, like sex ratios, and once you start collecting more and more frogs, you can kind of get a good idea for, how big the frogs are, and other things that might be related to your studies, such as disease, um, and things of that nature. And this is kind of one of the, I guess, drift fences, I was, kind of, worked on for a project. So this is a drift fence I set up in southeastern Oklahoma, and this drift fence is about 900 feet long, and we have a total of 50 of those pitfall traps, so 25 on the outside, and then 25 traps on the inside. So you can imagine, this fence has, or had a lot of potential to catch a lot of frogs and other amphibians and reptiles. But you can see that you can see these little buckets down here, along the fence. So if you zoom in on one of those buckets, you can see like kind of how this works for, how it catches the frogs. But so this bucket, you can see there's three different species. So the bigger one is a crawfish frog. This little guy is, a species of chorus frog, and then this guy hanging on the corner is actually it's called an American toad. So again, these are kind of the basic, trapping methods for conducting, frog research in general. And here's just some data from one of the years from working at that drift fence. So these are just here are these are just the five most common frogs that are I found in this area or in this single pond. There was a lot more species found here, but these are just the more common ones. So you can see that, based on, just 1 years of data and, a couple months time frame, we found, 92 crawfish frogs, over 400 toads, 130 leopard frogs, over 100 of these little chorus frogs, and then, about 30 of these pickerel frogs. And what you'll notice is these blue lines indicate frogs that enter. So on the y-axis, we have number of individuals coming in, and then on the x-axis, we have the date of capture. So you see the blue lines indicate frogs that enter the pond, while the red lines indicate frogs that exit the pond. So you can kind of notice trends in like when these frogs are actually breeding in the pond, which is actually pretty useful for trying to understand more about the species, right? And so you'll notice that some frogs, like this leopard frog, they have a very kind of broad, I guess, duration from when they breed. You can see that they exited and entered the pond throughout the whole time of the study. But then when we look at things like American toads, you'll notice that, oh, within like they only were in the pond for a brief 2 week period of time. So it's kind of cool. You can kind of compare and contrast species and learn about their different ecologies. And some species might be very explosive breeders, while others are more kind of longer duration based breeders. So those are kind of some examples of data you can actually obtain from kind of these trapping method studies. And and then also, this is another kind of cool component you can kind of gain from these, I guess, drift fin studies too. So if you, so here's kind of an aerial view of this drift fins pond. You can see all these white circles are those pitfall traps I was talking about earlier. And then, so once you can kind of, once you collect your data on what species are coming in from different areas of the pond, you can kind of make assumptions about, what might be important for certain types of species. So, for example, one of our species, you can see that most of the, I guess, entering locations for the species came from this kind of this western, southwestern direction. And you can't really see based on this figure, but actually in this area, there was a lot more like kind of wooded habitat. So you can kind of make inferences about that species and how it might be very ecologically tied to these more wooded habitats compared to these more opened kind of barren landscape areas that might be on the other side of the fence or on the other side of the pond. So some species might be, basically overwintering in sites that are, under logs and kind of under leaf litter, which might not exist elsewhere relative to the pond. So again, these are the type of data you can actually start learning a lot more information about specific species and what might be important for their ecology and even their conservation if you're trying to do some like habitat management for future efforts. And this is kind of a cool, and I know that some of this stuff at the beginning is just kind of methods-based stuff, but this is kind of just showing you like how you can actually mark specific individual frogs. So you can use what are called these pit tags, which on the top left you can kind of see one there, but these are basically like essentially little microchips you can use for individual identification. So what happens is like if there's this one species I was studying, you can kind of make a small little cut on their abdomen, just on their skin, and you can put this tag in there. And actually, after one day, we've recaught these frogs, and their skin has fully healed over. So it's not a very invasive method. But you can see that the purpose of this is if you're trying to maybe assess, how many individuals are in a pond, you don't want to actually capture the same individual over and over again. So you want to give some individuals like again a unique identification. So then you can even start tracking things like growth rate, how many times you've actually captured it, and it's a very useful way to again measure and mark these individual frogs. So that's kind of a cool representation of what it looks like when it's inside the frog. And then I also do a little bit of, I guess, morphology work too. So on the left, you can see that that's a X-ray or a radiograph of a bunch of green tree frogs. And so morphology is very useful for like species identification and trait function. So you can actually get really cool, detailed, oriented measurements on like frog bones and toe pads and things of that nature. And then you can also do, I guess, a different method for kind of morphological analysis, which is this method on the right. Basically, it's called micro CT scanning. You can actually, instead of doing, so this on the left is a radiograph, that's a 2D plane. But if you use this method, you can basically get this like three-dimensional shape of what the frog bones actually look like. And again, this is a better approach for getting that rich type of data. And then this is kind of, again, I really like this method because I've been recently working with it. So you basically can put a frog into a machine, and this machine will spin and rotate this frog, right? And so what's happening is there's thousands of X-rays that are being emitted from one side, and then there's a detector plate that absorbs all these X-rays. So as the frog's spinning, it's getting a different angle of that frog in time and space. And so what happens is you can actually reconstruct these X-rays and kind of put them all together, and you can kind of get this again this three-dimensional image, which is actually really, really useful again for getting those very detailed oriented things you might not be able to get from measuring something with, a ruler or again those 2D like radiographs. So this is a frog skull on top of this is just an example of what I was able to pull from this crawfish frog. So it's again, this is a kind of a newer, I guess, method for using kind of morphology for kind of data analysis and data management. And so and then this is kind of what you can actually, if you collected a bunch of data, skull data on different species that are like closely related, you can kind of tease apart differences among species. So this data is really useful for like species delimitation, and when you're studying species that look very, very similar. So these are four frogs that are all pretty related. So these frogs on the right, these three right here, these are all kind of in the same clade. They look very similar, and they most likely have similar morphologies. And so what you can do is when you can plot this data from the skulls, you can kind of see like relationships that individuals share among species, and you can kind of see the differences among species. And so you can kind of see that this is a gopher frog on the bottom and a crawfish frog on the top. You can see these species have like very, very robust and wide skulls versus these, leopard frogs and pickerel frogs. I showed you earlier, they have very narrow skulls. And then you can see there's differences also in like the pointiness, how rounded they are at the snout. And again, this is kind of a very useful way of looking at differences among species. And some species you can't really tell apart phenotypically. If you're just looking at one species and another species, sometimes they look exactly the same. So these type of morphological, uh, this type of morphological data can be very useful for actually distinguishing them from each other. And here's I guess, what you call like an evolutionary relationship or a phylogeny of these skulls plotted. And so on the very left is kind of this is a kind of an older species. People will say it's more ancestral. And then on the very right is the more derived species, right? So it's the more recent species. And what you'll notice is as you go from the older species to the newer species, you'll see kind of the skull gets a little bit wider and wider. So this is actually very, very useful. This is actually very cool. Can you kind of seeing trends over time? So maybe over time, the species has been developing, a wider skull, and it kind of it's kind of cool to also relate things back to ecology. So these three frogs at the bottom, they all use different subterranean shelters and burrows. That are not used by this leopard frog. So crawfish frogs live in crayfish burrows, gopher frogs live in gopher tortoise burrows, and these pickerel frogs live in cave systems. So sometimes it makes you think, how much of their skull morphology is actually being contributed from their, unique ecology and what they use in their environments. And so those are just some examples of, kind of some research I do and kind of how certain methods might be useful. But now I'm going to start talking to you guys about like, what it means to be a frog and what are frogs. So I'll start out with some basic vocabulary here. So amphibians basically consists of three groups. So the group is called Lissamphibia, but there's frogs and toads, which is the order Anura. Then you have salamanders, which are usually called Quadrata.